Tokyo, April 1942. In the heavily guarded offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, a thin stack of intercepted American press clippings lay on a polished wooden table. The papers, forwarded by intelligence officers from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, had been translated with care. The headlines, though written for American readers thousands of miles away, carried a weight that chilled the room. New warships pouring from U.S. yards. America launches a battleship a month. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, the tide rises. Captain Toshikazu Ohmae, a staff officer who had studied in Britain before the war, read aloud the English text with clipped precision. Around the table, senior commanders listened in silence. To men who had grown up revering the battleship as the core of naval power, the implications were staggering. One admiral finally muttered, "This must be Roosevelt's propaganda." But no one laughed. Just 4 months earlier, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had wagered everything on the surprise strike at Pearl Harbor. His logic was brutally simple. Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The only hope was to cripple the American fleet at the outset, destroying its battleships before American shipyards could bring their industrial weight to bear. The gamble had seemed successful. On December 7, 1941, 8 U.S. battleships had been sunk or heavily damaged, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and the proud Pacific Fleet humbled. Japanese officers celebrated with sake, convinced they had bought at least 2 years of uncontested dominance. But Yamamoto himself was never convinced. He told Prime Minister Tojo that morning, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." By spring 1942, that fear was turning to reality. The documents before the staff in Tokyo were not propaganda. They were reflections of a truth already visible in shipyards from Brooklyn to Bremerton. The roots lay in the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, passed after the fall of France. It was the largest naval expansion in American history. 18 aircraft carriers, 7 new battleships, 6 battlecruisers, 27 cruisers, 115 destroyers, and 43 submarines authorized in a single stroke. Before Pearl Harbor, keels had already been laid. After Pearl Harbor, construction accelerated with feverish urgency. In January 1942, the U.S. Navy launched the battleship Indiana. In February came Massachusetts. In April, Alabama. By the end of 1942, South Dakota and New Jersey would follow. Japanese intelligence officers tried to dismiss the reports. No nation could produce such behemoths so quickly. Yet aerial reconnaissance confirmed new silhouettes crowding American harbors, their hull numbers painted fresh. Rear Admiral Sadatoshi Tomioka, head of the operations section, summarized the disbelief in a memo later captured by Allied forces. "Our naval policy assumed a battleship requires 3 years from keel to completion. Reports of monthly launches must be exaggeration. If true, our assumptions are invalid and victory is impossible." While the Japanese pored over rumors, American yards roared day and night. The emergency shipbuilding program, directed by the Maritime Commission, converted automobile plants, steel mills, and rail yards into a ship production empire. Workers who had never seen the sea before now riveted hull plates at Kaiser's Richmond yards in California. Whole classes of Liberty ships went from blueprint to launch in under 60 days. At Newport News, the slipways that once berthed one ship at a time now worked in parallel, laying down multiple hulls simultaneously. Naval shipyards, backed by billions in federal contracts, delivered on the Two-Ocean Navy promise. By the end of 1942, the U.S. Navy had added over 1 million tons of new warships, including the most modern battleships afloat. The numbers dwarfed Japanese capacity. In 1942, Japan launched 600,000 tons of warships. The US launched twice that, with greater tonnage every succeeding year. On May 3, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Tadao Chihaya, serving in naval intelligence, brought another report to the General Staff. It cited Lockheed, Boeing, and Newport News production figures published in American trade journals. The crucial line was underlined in red pencil: the United States has the capacity to complete one battleship every 4 to 6 weeks through 1943. When Chihaya read the line aloud, one commander slammed his fist on the table. Impossible. They exaggerate to frighten us. But Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, spoke quietly. No, gentlemen. It is not exaggeration. It is mathematics. They have more steel, more shipyards, more workers. If they choose, they can. The room fell silent. The realization was more terrifying than any battleship broadside. Japan had miscalculated the very foundation of the war. Captured Japanese documents after the war revealed the psychological weight of these reports. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, wrote in his diary that summer, "The Americans build ships as though they were automobiles. We destroy one carrier and another appears. How can we fight an enemy who manufactures fleets?" Other officers echoed the despair. A junior staff officer wrote, "At Midway, we believed victory would delay their recovery. Yet already they launch more ships than we possess. If true, our navy will be strangled not by battle, but by production." The contrast was stark. Japan's shipyards at Kure and Yokosuka could produce perhaps one major warship every 18 months. Steel and fuel shortages worsened delays. Meanwhile, American yards launched carriers, cruisers, and destroyers with conveyor belt efficiency. Yamamoto, though preparing for his decisive thrust at Midway, knew the arithmetic was fatal. He confided to his aides in May 1942, "If we do not strike quickly, by next year the enemy will have twice our fleet. By 1944, 3 times, and beyond that, numbers without limit." The Japanese Navy's greatest shock was not that America claimed to be building a battleship every month. The shock was discovering that the claim was true. By 1943, as the Essex-class carriers poured off the ways, the phrase became more than a rumour. It was reality measured in steel and tonnage, in hull numbers crowding the Pacific. What Japanese officers dismissed as American bravado in spring 1942 became the grim arithmetic of defeat. Pearl Harbor had brought only a fleeting advantage. The United States was awakening, and its shipyards would drown Japan in steel. In the hushed rooms of Tokyo's naval headquarters, as reports confirmed the scale of America's construction, the officers felt the same dread Yamamoto had warned of. They were no longer fighting a fleet. They were fighting an industrial nation that could launch a battleship every month, and soon far more. Brooklyn Navy Yard, June 1942. The East River shimmered in the summer sun as cranes swung overhead, lowering armor plate into the hull of a battleship still skeletal on its ways. Sparks cascaded from welders' torches while riveters hammered in furious rhythm. Thousands of workers, men too old for the draft, women in overalls, teenagers barely out of school, streamed through the gates each morning. From the roof lines, the silhouettes of carriers and cruisers grew like skyscrapers, steel rising faster than the skyline of Manhattan. It was the living embodiment of Roosevelt's promise, the arsenal of democracy. The statistics were almost beyond comprehension. By mid-1942, the United States had mobilized over 2 million workers in shipbuilding alone. The nation had converted automobile assembly lines to churn out turbines, steel mills to forge armor plate, and textile factories to weave signal flags and canvas. At Newport News, Virginia, 3 slipways worked simultaneously, each launching a capital ship. In Philadelphia, yards extended their dry docks to fit carriers longer than any vessel yet seen. At Puget Sound, hulls for cruisers, destroyers, and carriers took shape under the misty rain. The pace was relentless. In 1942 alone, American shipyards produced 1,200 new vessels of all classes. Destroyers slid into the water like toys. escort carriers followed in swarms. Even the mightiest hulls, battleships of the Iowa and South Dakota classes, emerged in less than 2 years from keel laying to commissioning. Japan, by contrast, had only a handful of naval yards, all limited by steel shortages, dock space, and skilled labour. Kure and Yokosuka launched ships at a pace measured in years, not months. Though admirals loved to count battleships and carriers, the real miracle was the background thunder of mass production, the Liberty Ship program. Henry J. Kaiser, an Oregon industrialist with no prior shipbuilding experience, created yards that broke every precedent. Prefabricated sections were welded together rather than riveted, shaving months off construction. In 1942, the average Liberty ship took 150 days to build. By 1943, the record was 4 days, 15 hours. These cargo ships, plain, slow, utilitarian, became the arteries of war. They carried the oil, aviation fuel, munitions and food that sustained fleets across the Pacific. As Admiral Ernest King wrote in his diary, "A carrier without its oilers is no more than a floating pier." Japanese intelligence dismissed Liberty ships as unworthy of attention, yet the sheer volume broke their calculations. For every Japanese freighter sunk, America launched 2 replacements. Where Japan bled from the silent war of attrition against submarines, the US overcame losses with industrial rhythm. To Japanese admirals, battleships remained the ultimate measure of strength. Yamato and Musashi were conceived as invincible castles of steel, each mounting 18-inch guns no American vessel could match. Yet even as those leviathans slid into service, US yards were launching modern battleships in series. North Carolina, Washington, South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts, Alabama, Iowa. What startled Japanese observers most was not just the speed, but the casual manner. Where Japan had poured its entire industrial soul into building a single Yamato over 4 years, America seemed to produce battleships as a byproduct, while devoting its main energy to carriers. The Essex-class carriers, first laid down in 1941, were entering the water in waves. By late 1942, Essex herself prepared for commissioning. Behind her came Lexington II, Yorktown II, Bunker Hill, Intrepid. By 1945, 24 of these floating airfields would serve. To Japanese planners who imagined each capital ship as irreplaceable, this defied logic. A carrier lost at Coral Sea or Midway could be replaced in less than a year. The American fleet became a hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more emerged. The disbelief was preserved in Japanese records and later interrogations. Rear Admiral Takagi Sokichi, captured in 1945, recalled his staff's reaction to intercepted reports of US launches. "We thought perhaps their journalists had mistaken destroyers for battleships. The idea that a nation could build a warship of 35,000 tons in 12 months was absurd." But in 1943, our pilots reported new names and hull numbers: Alabama, South Dakota, Iowa. It was then we realized the absurd was true. From the American side, the miracle was explained not in strategy but in labor. A welder at Kaiser's Richmond Yard, interviewed decades later, said simply, "We didn't think of battleships or carriers. We thought of paychecks, shifts, and quotas. You laid down steel, you welded seams, and you went home. The ships just kept coming." By autumn 1942, the arithmetic was undeniable. America had replaced the battleships lost at Pearl Harbor, commissioned new carriers faster than Japan could replace a single one, and launched destroyers and escorts in numbers that clogged Pacific anchorages. A report by the 13th Fighter Command that year noted with astonishment the sight of rows of transports and carriers at Noumea, stretching beyond the horizon. Even American officers marveled. "Steel flows like water here," wrote a naval commander, "and every drop becomes a ship." For Japanese planners, the implications were crushing. Their war plans had rested on the assumption that America could not replace its initial losses quickly. By late 1942, that assumption was dead. The arsenal of democracy was no slogan. It was a shipyard chorus that never slept, a factory line that forged fleets as casually as a nation of mechanics once built automobiles. Tokyo, late 1942. The air in the operations section of the Imperial Navy was heavy with smoke. Maps of the Pacific, dotted with pins and red string, covered the walls. Yet behind the symbols of victory at Coral Sea and Savo Island, unease crept in. The arithmetic of construction could not be ignored. From its inception, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built itself around the doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. The logic was simple. Japan, with fewer resources, could not match American numbers. Instead, it would lure the US fleet across the Pacific, attrit it with submarines and aircraft, then destroy it in a climactic gun duel with the combined fleet. This doctrine demanded quality over quantity. Japan invested in warships of exquisite craftsmanship. The Yamato-class battleships, capable of outgunning anything afloat. The Shōkaku-class carriers, among the most advanced of their time. Each hull was a work of engineering pride, but also an irreplaceable treasure. By contrast, American planning under the Two-Ocean Navy Act assumed losses. Ships were tools, not icons. The United States built them in series, planned replacements before the keels were laid, and accepted that some would be sunk. The contrast would become fatal. Japan's shipbuilding was concentrated in a handful of yards: Kure, Yokosuka, Nagasaki, Mitsubishi, Kobe, Kawasaki. These facilities were capable but limited by geography, workforce, and resources. Japan's steel production in 1942 amounted to less than 10% of America's. Oil, aluminum, and copper were all scarce. Even at maximum capacity, Japanese yards could complete perhaps 2 or 3 major warships per year. And each one was a gamble. Yamato consumed so much steel and labour that destroyer and escort construction slowed. Shinano, begun as a third super battleship, was hastily converted to a carrier after Midway, but launched too late to matter. By comparison, US yards in 1942 alone launched more than 100 destroyers, 28 submarines, and 8 major combatants. The Guadalcanal campaign revealed the imbalance starkly. Between August and November 1942, Japanese forces fought fiercely, inflicting serious losses. The carrier Hornet, heavy cruisers Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, destroyers by the dozen. Japanese officers took grim satisfaction in the Tokyo Express night battles, where their long-lance torpedoes shredded Allied ships. Yet victory never came. For every cruiser lost, America dispatched 2 replacements. For every destroyer sunk, 3 arrived. Admiral Reizo Tanaka later admitted, "We thought attrition would favour us, because the enemy was far from his bases. But each month more American ships arrived, while our numbers dwindled. It was as though they had an endless ocean of steel." By the end of the campaign, the US Navy had absorbed losses that would have crippled Japan, yet still reinforced the Solomons with fresh battleships, Washington and South Dakota. Captured diaries reveal the disbelief spreading through the Japanese officer corps. One entry from December 1942, found in the effects of a staff officer at Rabaul, read, "We believed Pearl Harbor gave us time. Instead, already they bring new battleships into action. Do they build them overnight? The pace defies reason." Post-war interrogations confirmed this astonishment. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, questioned by Allied officers in 1946, conceded, "Our naval construction program was built on the premise that America could not replace capital ships quickly. When we saw new battleships fighting at Guadalcanal within a year of Pearl Harbor, we realized our assumptions were false. It was then clear the war was lost in the shipyards." Underlying the disparity was a cultural chasm. Japanese naval officers regarded battleships almost as living beings, imbued with spirit and destiny. Launch ceremonies invoked Shinto rites. The hull was seen as sacred. The Yamato was not merely a ship, but the embodiment of the nation. For Americans, a battleship was a contract number, a hull designation, a line on a production schedule. BB-57 South Dakota was followed by BB-58 Indiana, then BB-59 Massachusetts. They were interchangeable instruments, not icons. This difference explained why Japanese officers could not believe the reports of a battleship every month. To them, such ships were singular achievements. To Americans, they were serial products. By 1943, this realization hardened. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, recorded in his diary, "We confront not an enemy fleet, but an enemy factory. Each ship we sink is instantly replaced. Their power lies not in tactics, but in production." The phrase spread among junior officers. We are fighting a factory, not a fleet. Japan could still win battles, sometimes brilliantly, but the war itself was becoming unwinnable. The mismatch forced Japan into desperate measures. With battleships too precious to risk, they were often held back. Carriers, after Midway, could not be replaced fast enough. Destroyers, diverted to supply runs, wore out without relief. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy absorbed punishment and grew stronger. Shipyards launched vessels faster than submarines, and aircraft could sink them. Training programs kept pace, filling new decks with fresh sailors and aviators. By the end of 1942, the balance was shifting irreversibly. Japan had built its doctrine on a quick, decisive war. America had built its doctrine on an endless one. In the halls of the Naval General Staff, optimism faded. Even victories felt hollow. The arithmetic had betrayed them. Japan could not match American expectations because it had misunderstood them. Where Tokyo imagined battleships as singular jewels, Washington regarded them as coins minted from an inexhaustible treasury. The decisive battle doctrine had collapsed against industrial reality. What remained was a slow, grinding war of attrition. One Japan was doomed to lose. August 1942. The jungle-clad island of Guadalcanal became the first true testing ground of America's industrial awakening. What began as a desperate gamble, U.S. Marines landing with minimal naval support, evolved into a drawn-out attritional struggle that exposed the contrasting foundations of the two navies. In the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, Japanese destroyers and cruisers fought with extraordinary skill. The Tokyo Express, nightly supply and reinforcement runs, often mauled American surface forces. At Savo Island in August, Japanese heavy cruisers achieved one of the most lopsided night actions in naval history, sinking Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and Canberra. Japanese sailors believed such victories confirmed their superiority. But even as wrecks smouldered off Guadalcanal's beaches, replacement hulls were already steaming west. Within weeks, new cruisers and destroyers joined the fleet. Admiral Reizo Tanaka later reflected, "At first, we rejoiced that we could sink so many of their ships. Then we realized each month more appeared. We could not sink them as fast as America built them." The November 1942 naval battle of Guadalcanal brought the first appearance of fresh American battleships. On the night of November 14th to 15th, Washington and South Dakota, both commissioned only months earlier, engaged the Japanese battleship Kirishima. Japanese lookouts were stunned. Pearl Harbor's battleships, they believed, had crippled American power for years. Yet here were entirely new giants, already on station. Kirishima was mortally wounded by Washington's 16-inch salvos, capsizing before dawn. For the first time, Japanese officers confronted the consequence of America's building program. While Japan had lost one of its precious pre-war battleships, the Americans had fielded two replacements as if conjured from thin air. Post-war interrogation of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita confirmed the disbelief. "We could not understand how they could have two new battleships so soon after Pearl Harbor. We realized then that their production was beyond our imagining." Guadalcanal became a meat grinder. Japan lost 24 destroyers in 6 months, nearly a tenth of its total inventory. America lost a comparable number, but where Japanese losses were irreplaceable, US shipyards delivered more than 70 new destroyers in 1942 alone. Submarines, patrol craft, and carriers followed the same pattern. The carrier Wasp was torpedoed and sunk in September, but by year's end, Essex was fitting out at Newport News, the first of a class that would redefine naval warfare. Japanese officers understood the arithmetic. A captured operations diary from Rabaul noted bitterly, "For every ship we sink, 2 more appear. We fight like men emptying the sea with a bucket." The disparity extended beyond hulls. American ships arrived with abundant fuel, refrigerated stores, and spare parts. Japanese destroyers often operated at the limits of endurance, running nightly resupply missions with decks overloaded and crews exhausted. Survivors of the Udachi and Akatsuki, sunk in November, later told interrogators that their ships had been running almost continuously for weeks, with little time for maintenance. US destroyers, by contrast, rotated through forward bases and returned with fresh paint and provisions. The message to Japanese sailors was clear. They were fighting not just an enemy fleet, but an enemy machine that never tired. By early 1943, cracks appeared in Japanese morale. Letters intercepted from officers at Truk revealed growing despair. "Even when we destroy their carriers, more come. Their battleships are endless. Are we to fight ghosts conjured from their factories?" The belief that Pearl Harbor had bought years of supremacy was shattered. Instead, less than 12 months after the attack, America had battleships, cruisers, and carriers already back in action. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, visited Truk in December 1942. He recorded in his diary, "Guadalcanal bleeds us. We cannot reinforce without losing destroyers. Yet the Americans replace their losses endlessly. We are fighting a tide of steel that rises higher each month." This recognition marked a turning point. The decisive battle doctrine, a trit the Americans before the final clash, was unraveling. Instead of dwindling, the enemy's fleet swelled. Guadalcanal forced Japan onto the defensive. The inability to sustain losses meant that even tactical victories became strategic defeats. Every cruiser sunk, every destroyer lost, weakened the combined fleet beyond repair. For the US, Guadalcanal was proof of concept. Shipyards delivered replacements as fast as frontline commanders requested them. The industrial rhythm, begun under the Two-Ocean Navy Act, now bore fruit. By February 1943, when Japan evacuated Guadalcanal, the officers who survived carried home a sobering truth. They had not been defeated solely by tactics or gunnery. They had been defeated by numbers. The campaign revealed the shape of the war to come. Every month, new ships would arrive. Every battle, fresh squadrons would enter. Guadalcanal was not just a clash of fleets. It was the first proof that America's shipyards had transformed the Pacific War from a contest of strategy into a contest of production. And in that contest, Japan had already lost. Spring 1943. The war in the Pacific shifted from desperate holding actions to offensive momentum. Behind the transformation was not a single battle, but a continuous stream of steel flowing from American shipyards. What the Japanese had feared after Guadalcanal, an enemy whose losses only summoned replacements, now became undeniable. The United States was building not just ships, but an assembly line navy. On May 31, 1943, the aircraft carrier Essex steamed into Pearl Harbor. Barely a year had passed since Yorktown had sunk at Midway, yet her replacement already loomed over the harbor. At 872 feet long, displacing 27,100 tons, she was the first of a class of 24 fleet carriers authorized under the Two-Ocean Navy Act. Her commissioning was followed in rapid succession: Lexington, CV-16 in September, Bunker Hill in November, Intrepid in August. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-class carriers were at sea. In 1944, more than a dozen more would follow. Japanese intelligence intercepted reports of these launches. Officers at Truk initially dismissed them as exaggerations. But when reconnaissance confirmed multiple new carriers operating simultaneously in the Gilberts and Marshalls, disbelief gave way to dread. Vice Admiral Ugaki recorded in his diary after Tarawa, "The enemy has many new carriers, more than we thought possible. They are like mushrooms after rain. If carriers were the spear, destroyers were the shield." In 1942, Japan had entered Guadalcanal with a destroyer fleet superior in training and tactics. By 1943, the American Fletcher class was arriving in numbers that stunned observers. 175 Fletchers were commissioned between 1942 and 1944. They displaced 2,100 tons, carried 5 5-inch guns, and bristled with anti-aircraft batteries. Japanese submarine captain Mochitsura Hashimoto later remarked, "Where once American convoys were weakly guarded, now every task force seemed to have destroyers beyond counting." The Fletcher class was followed by the Allen M. Sumner and Gearing classes, each iteration produced with the efficiency of Detroit automakers stamping automobiles. The transformation was visible in American shipyards. Newport News, Norfolk, Brooklyn, Mare Island, and Puget Sound operated around the clock. At Kaiser's West Coast yards, Liberty ships rolled off the ways in under 30 days. At Newport News, Essex was laid down, launched, and commissioned in less than 18 months. This industrial miracle was not improvisation, but planning. The U.S. Maritime Commission coordinated resources, standardized designs, and mobilized a workforce of millions, including women who became the iconic Rosie the Riveters. In contrast, Japan's shipyards labored under shortages of steel, fuel, and skilled labor. By 1943, air raids on Kure and Yokosuka disrupted production schedules. Japanese shipwrights worked with dwindling supplies, while their American counterparts had access to almost limitless raw materials. Numbers told the story better than any admiral's testimony. Battleships. Between 1940 and 1944, the U.S. Navy commissioned 10 fast battleships, North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes. Japan built none after Yamato and Musashi. Carriers. From 1942 to 1945, America launched 24 Essex-class fleet carriers and 9 Independence-class light carriers. Japan added only a handful, mostly conversions from damaged cruisers. Destroyers. The US commissioned more than 350 destroyers during the war. Japan launched fewer than 60. Submarines. The US produced 203 fleet submarines, strangling Japanese logistics. By mid-1943, Japanese officers no longer laughed at American propaganda claiming a ship a week. They saw the reality in battle after battle. When American forces retook Attu in May 1943, the task force included new destroyers that had not existed the year before. By November, during Operation Galvanic at Tarawa, the fleet fielded Essex, Bunker Hill, Independence, and Yorktown, CV-10, all newly commissioned. For Japanese planners, this was staggering. Just 18 months after Midway, the U.S. Navy had more carriers in action than Japan had ever possessed at its peak. Captain Toshikazu Ohmae, staff officer under Admiral Spruance, later recalled a captured Japanese diary. "The enemy's ships multiply like ants. Destroy one and 2 more appear." American doctrine evolved alongside new construction. Carrier task forces operated in groups of 4, rotating flight operations and overwhelming Japanese defences. At Tarawa and Makin, this concentration of power demonstrated what mass production enabled: sustained air cover, relentless bombardment, and logistical resilience. By contrast, Japanese carriers, starved of fuel and pilots, sailed in smaller groups. After the loss of Hyo in June 1944, Japan could no longer risk its carriers in major engagements. Captured Japanese officers after the war spoke of their astonishment at American shipbuilding. Captain Shigeru Fukudome, interrogated in 1945, admitted, "We believed that by sinking 4 carriers at Midway, we had destroyed the core of their fleet. When 8 new carriers appeared in 1943, we knew our calculations were wrong." Rear Admiral Sadatoshi Tomioka, Chief of Plans for the Imperial Navy, told interrogators, "We assumed American industry was strong, but we did not believe it could replace a carrier in less than 2 years. Instead, they replaced 4 in 1 year. This was beyond our comprehension." In February 1943, the Iowa was commissioned, followed by New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. Capable of 33 knots, armed with 9 16-inch 50-caliber guns, and heavily armored, they symbolized America's ability to outbuild even in categories once thought untouchable. When Iowa escorted carriers in late 1943, Japanese scouts mistook her for a resurrected Yamato. The reality was more unsettling. She was not unique, but the first of 4, with more planned. What shocked Japanese officers most was not simply numbers, but speed. Shipyard managers described the process as industrialized warship production. Prefabricated sections allowed hulls to be welded together like giant kits. Training programs standardized crews, allowing new ships to deploy almost immediately. Japanese memoirs from officers at Truk reveal their frustration. "We had to train 6 months for a ship to be ready." The Americans had ships arrive with crews already seasoned. Their system was relentless. By late 1943, American commanders no longer feared attrition. Admiral Nimitz could order operations knowing replacements were already on the way. The Central Pacific Drive, through the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, was planned on the assumption of continuous reinforcement. For Japan, the realization was crushing. Attrition, once the core of Yamamoto's strategy, no longer mattered. Every ship sunk, every plane lost, was replaced before the next battle. By the beginning of 1944, Japanese officers fully understood the scale they faced. The combined fleet could muster perhaps 6 carriers, short of fuel and trained pilots. The Americans could deploy over a dozen Essex-class and light carriers, each bristling with aircraft. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who would command at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, lamented in post-war testimony, "Even if we won one battle, we could not win the war. Their shipyards would erase our victory within weeks." The years 1943 and 1944 marked the turning of the tide not just at sea, but in the shipyards. American industry no longer merely replaced losses. It overwhelmed the enemy with an accelerating tide of steel. For Japanese officers who had once believed Pearl Harbor bought time, the truth was now undeniable. They had awakened a nation capable of launching battleships, carriers, and destroyers faster than Japan could count them. The assembly line navy was not simply a fleet. It was a machine of war on a scale the world had never seen, and it was only just beginning. June 1944. In the skies over the Marianas, the balance of the Pacific War was displayed in a single battle. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just an aerial massacre, it was the visible proof of what Japanese officers had whispered since Guadalcanal. America's shipyards had built a navy too large to defeat. By mid-1944, the United States had advanced across the Central Pacific, seizing the Gilberts and Marshalls. The next target was the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were vital. From their airfields, B-29 bombers could strike Japan itself. The Japanese combined fleet, commanded by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, sailed to stop the invasion. On paper, it looked formidable. 9 carriers, including Taiho, Japan's newest armoured deck carrier, supported by battleships Yamato and Musashi. Yet even before the fleets met, Japanese staff officers knew the truth. Their carriers were underfueled, their pilots undertrained, their reserves exhausted. Against them stood Task Force 58, 15 carriers, most of them Essex-class, accompanied by 7 battleships and more than 900 aircraft. It was not a fleet versus a fleet. It was an industrial economy versus a nation already bled white. Japanese pilots expected to face perhaps 4 or 5 American carriers. Instead, as they approached, they counted more than a dozen flight decks stretching to the horizon. Lieutenant Commander Haruo Yoshino, flying with the 653rd Naval Air Group, later confessed in interrogation, "We thought we would fight one fist. Instead, we met many fists, striking together. Their carriers were endless. The Essex-class carriers formed the backbone, each carrying nearly 100 aircraft. Alongside them sailed Independence-class light carriers and fast battleships like Iowa and New Jersey. For every Japanese sortie, Americans launched 3. On June 19th, waves of Japanese aircraft hurled themselves at the American task force. The result was slaughter. American radar directed fighter interceptions long before Japanese planes neared the fleet. Hellcats of the U.S. Navy tore through formations of inexperienced pilots. By dusk, nearly 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Only 29 American planes were lost. The disparity was not only in training but in numbers. U.S. carriers could rotate squadrons, maintain reserves, and rearm with astonishing speed. Japanese decks, with limited crews and dwindling munitions, grew slower with every wave. A Japanese after-action report, later captured, admitted, "We lost not only aircraft, but the heart of our air strength. We cannot replace these pilots, but the enemy seems to have pilots without end." The battle also revealed another industrial truth. Japan could not protect its carriers, nor replace them. On June 19th, the new carrier Taiho was torpedoed by USS Albacore. Poor damage control led to catastrophic explosions. The Shōkaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, was sunk the same day by USS Kavala. In a single afternoon, Japan lost its newest carrier and one of its oldest. The combined fleet's air power was broken. By contrast, America had so many carriers that the loss of one, had it occurred, would have been only a footnote. Already, new Essex-class hulls were fitting out in Brooklyn, Newport News, and San Francisco. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was decided before the first shot. American aircraft launched, approximately 900. Japanese aircraft launched, approximately 450. Japanese aircraft lost, approximately 350. American aircraft lost, 29. Carriers sunk, Japan, 2. Carriers sunk, US, 0. The statistics revealed a war of production, not tactics. Even if Japan had scored better, sinking several carriers, replacements would arrive within months. Japan, by contrast, could not replace even one. Post-war interrogations record the psychological blow. Admiral Ozawa admitted, "It was then we realized we had lost not only a battle, but the war. We had no more trained aviators, no more carriers. The Americans had many, and more coming." Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, wrote in his memoir, "At the Marianas, I felt the weight of American industry more than at any other time. We had awakened a giant, and it crushed us not with genius but with factories." With the Marianas secured, America gained forward bases for the B-29 campaign. Japan lost its last chance to contest the Central Pacific. The decisive battle Yamamoto had envisioned had come, and it proved decisive not because of tactics, but because of production. Japanese naval staff officers admitted in their war diary, "The decisive battle doctrine is finished. We cannot win when the enemy has more carriers every month." The industrial tide, first glimpsed at Guadalcanal, now swept over the Pacific in full force. By summer 1944, American shipyards were delivering carriers faster than Japanese intelligence could track them. In July, Bennington and Ticonderoga were commissioned. By the end of the year, more Essex-class hulls than the entire pre-war Japanese carrier fleet were afloat. The Philippines campaign loomed next. Behind it stood an unstoppable arsenal, shipyards, training schools, and supply lines that dwarfed anything Japan could muster. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not merely an American victory. It was the physical revelation of what Japanese admirals had feared since Pearl Harbor: America's ability to build a new fleet while fighting with the old. Every burning Japanese aircraft, every sinking carrier, was proof of a larger truth, that America's factories had already won the war. In June 1944, over the waters of the Marianas, the industrial war became visible. The tide was no longer rising. It had already crested, and it would not recede. October 1944. In the waters of the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed into its greatest and final battle. Operation Shogo, the defense of Leyte, was not conceived as a chance to win the war outright, but as a desperate gamble to stave off disaster. American forces had landed on Leyte to begin the liberation of the Philippines. If Japan lost the archipelago, it would be cut off from its last vital oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. The combined fleet gathered nearly all its remaining strength. But behind the bold plans and brave words lay a grim truth already recognized by Japanese officers. The balance of industrial power had made the outcome inevitable. Admiral Soemu Toyoda ordered the remnants of the fleet into 4 prongs. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita led the center force, including Yamato, Musashi, and a corps of battleships and cruisers. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the northern force, a decoy carrier group meant to lure Halsey's Third Fleet away. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and Vice Admiral Kiyo Hideshima led southern forces to converge through Surigao Strait. On paper, the fleet was formidable: 4 battleships, 9 carriers, mostly empty of planes, 19 cruisers, 34 destroyers. In reality, it was a shadow of the mighty combined fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor. Fuel shortages forced rationing, pilots were green and few, carriers were stripped of aircraft to reinforce land bases. Admiral Kurita confided to a staff officer before departure, "We go not to victory, but to sacrifice. We hope only to delay the inevitable." Opposing them was the U.S. Navy at the height of its industrial power. Admiral William Halsey commanded Task Force 38 with 17 carriers, 6 fast battleships, and hundreds of destroyers. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid led the 7th Fleet with 6 escort carriers, 18 escort carriers, and older battleships resurrected from Pearl Harbor. The scale was staggering. American forces around Leyte comprised more than 800 ships, including transports, supply vessels, and auxiliaries. The fleet dwarfed anything Japan could muster. Even if Kurita struck a blow, replacements were already on the way from American shipyards. On October 24th, as Kurita's center force entered the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier planes found them. Waves of aircraft from Essex, Lexington, and Intrepid attacked relentlessly. The giant battleship Musashi, pride of the Japanese Navy, absorbed more punishment than any warship in history: 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes. She finally capsized and sank, taking more than 1,000 sailors with her. For the Japanese, it was a symbol of futility. The world's largest battleship, constructed at immense cost in secrecy, destroyed in a single day by planes launched from ships America had built in months. An officer aboard Yamato later wrote, "We had built a sword too heavy to lift. They answered with swarms of planes from carriers beyond counting." On October 25th, Nishimura's southern force attempted to break through Surigao Strait. Waiting for them was Admiral Jesse Oldendorf with a battle line of 6 U.S. battleships, including West Virginia and California, both raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor. In the last battleship-to-battleship action in history, American radar-directed gunnery annihilated the Japanese. Yamashiro and Fuso were sunk, along with most of their escorts. For Japanese survivors, the shock was profound. Ships once believed destroyed at Pearl Harbor had returned from the grave to finish the fight. The most desperate clash came off Samar, where Kurita's battleships stumbled upon a group of American escort carriers and destroyers. Taffy 3. Outgunned and outmatched, the small American force fought with ferocity, launching torpedo attacks and dive-bombing runs. Despite their advantage, Japanese gunners were confused by smoke screens, aggressive destroyer charges, and relentless airstrikes. Kurita, fearing he was engaging a larger force, turned back. The moment encapsulated the new reality. American production had so saturated the seas that even escort carriers and destroyers seemed to appear in endless numbers. Japanese commanders could no longer distinguish between main fleet units and auxiliaries. There were simply too many enemy ships. Meanwhile, Admiral Ozawa's northern force drew Halsey north with its depleted carriers. Most had only a handful of aircraft aboard, serving as sacrificial bait. 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, were sunk. Zuikaku, last of the Pearl Harbor attackers, went down with her crew singing. Her loss symbolized the death of the old carrier fleet. Ozawa admitted after the war, "We were not carriers, but targets. We lured the enemy, but we had nothing left to fight with." Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history, and Japan's last. They lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More than 12,000 sailors died. In contrast, American losses were small: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and 3 destroyers. Within weeks, replacements had already joined the fleet. Japanese staff officers recorded in the war diary, "We have no more fleet. Even if we build ships, we have no fuel, no pilots, no time. The Americans have more carriers than we have aircraft." The decisive battle Yamamoto had sought had finally come, but instead of crippling the US fleet, it destroyed Japan's. After Leyte, Japan's navy ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Yamato remained, but fuel shortages kept her in port until her suicidal final sortie in 1945. The few remaining carriers were empty shells. For American commanders, the victory confirmed what shipyards had already ensured. The Pacific was theirs. Industrial power had provided the numbers, training, and replacements to crush Japan's last gamble. Leyte Gulf was not just the end of the Japanese fleet, it was the end of an illusion. For years, Japanese planners had believed one decisive battle could secure victory. But by 1944, industrial disparity had grown so vast that no tactical brilliance could bridge it. Japan gambled everything at Leyte, and in doing so revealed the hopelessness of its cause. America could lose ships and replace them in months. Japan lost its last fleet and had no means to build another. As Admiral Kurita confessed after the war, "We fought against not just ships, but a whole nation of shipbuilders. It was not a battle of fleets, but of factories." By spring 1945, the Japanese Navy was no longer a fleet, but fragments: hulls without fuel, carriers without planes, officers without hope. Yet the war was not finished. The Americans had moved steadily westward, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls, from the Marianas to the Philippines. The next step, Okinawa, was not merely another island. It was the doorstep to Japan itself. For the Imperial Navy, there were no more illusions of victory. What remained was sacrifice, a desperate hope that blood could purchase time, and that time might yield a miracle. On April 6, 1945, the battleship Yamato departed Tokuyama with 9 escorts. Her orders were extraordinary: beach herself on Okinawa and become a stationary fortress, fighting until destroyed. She carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. For her crew of 3,000, there was no expectation of return. Japanese officers told them plainly, "Your duty is to fight until the ship is sunk. You will not come home." Within hours, American submarines and reconnaissance planes reported Yamato's movements. On April 7th, more than 300 carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 descended upon her. Bombs and torpedoes shattered her defences. At 2:23 p.m., she exploded in a cataclysm that killed most of her crew. The largest battleship in history, pride of the Imperial Navy, was destroyed not by another ship, but by the inexhaustible reach of American carrier aviation. A Japanese survivor later said, "We realized then our nation had built the greatest ship in the world, but the Americans had built 1,000 planes to sink her." Okinawa witnessed the largest suicide campaign in history. The Special Attack Corps, kamikaze, flung thousands of planes at the invasion fleet. Between April and June, more than 1,500 kamikaze sorties struck. American ships suffered terribly. 36 sunk, 368 damaged. Nearly 5,000 sailors were killed, more than at Pearl Harbor. Destroyers burned, carriers smoldered, and radar pickets were torn apart by desperate dives. Yet the attacks revealed the chasm in resources. For every kamikaze that struck, 2 or 3 were shot down. And behind every American ship lost stood new hulls already launched in San Francisco, Philadelphia, or Newport News. Replacement destroyers steamed west faster than kamikazes could destroy them. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner wrote in his after-action report, "For every ship we lost at Okinawa, the yards at home launched 3. The enemy could bleed us, but he could not stop us." The battle lasted 82 days. Supplying the vast armada at Okinawa required an effort larger than many entire navies. The U.S. Navy's service squadrons, floating bases of oilers, repair ships, ammunition vessels, kept the fleet operating indefinitely. Japanese officers observing this scale of logistics admitted defeat. One post-war interrogation of Captain Toshikazu Ohmae recorded, "It was not your weapons that defeated us, but your ability to keep them supplied. We fought battles, you fought a war of factories. Japan, by contrast, had virtually no fuel. Aircraft sat idle for lack of gasoline. Destroyers were towed to sea on final missions because they could not reach cruising speed under their own power. After Yamato's destruction, the Imperial Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its remaining carriers, Katsuragi and Amagi, sat in harbour as empty hulls. Cruisers and destroyers were trapped for lack of fuel. Submarines undertook desperate transport runs, carrying rice instead of torpedoes. By the summer of 1945, the once proud combined fleet was reduced to a fleet in being, rusting in port while the Americans encircled Japan. By Okinawa, American shipyards had achieved near miraculous production. Aircraft carriers, 24 Essex-class fleet carriers completed between 1943 to 45. Destroyers, more than 350 Fletcher-class launched, with new Allen M. Sumner and Gearing classes arriving in squadrons. Battleships. The Iowa class joined the fleet, 33 knot giants bristling with 16-inch guns. Landing ships, hundreds of LSTs and attack transports carried divisions across oceans. Official Navy records show that in 1944 alone, the U.S. launched 38 aircraft carriers of all types, 349 destroyers, and over 1,500 landing ships. Japanese intelligence officers captured at war's end confessed disbelief. "We thought reports of one battleship every month were exaggerations. Then we saw Essex carriers appear as if they were destroyers. Your industry was a second army." American newspapers openly published launch ceremonies. Photographs of shipyards in Brooklyn, Newport News, and Richmond showed rows of hulls in every stage of construction. Liberty ships slid down ways every few days. New destroyers were commissioned faster than Japan could train crews to fight them. Japanese leaders dismissed some of these as propaganda until their own reports confirmed the truth. One 1945 Japanese naval diary read simply, "America has more carriers than we have aircraft. We cannot continue the war." For Japanese sailors and aviators, Okinawa was the final revelation. No matter how many kamikazes struck, the Americans did not falter. Their ships returned, their fleets expanded, their supplies never failed. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who launched the final kamikaze mission on August 15th, after hearing of surrender, reflected in his diary. "We have fought bravely, but bravery cannot defeat steel poured from endless furnaces. We face a foe who can waste what we cannot afford to lose once." When Japan surrendered, its admirals understood what had broken them. Not just bombs or battles, but the American arsenal itself. The ability to construct, supply, and replace faster than losses could be inflicted made defeat inevitable. In post-war interviews, many officers admitted that the decisive battle doctrine, Yamamoto's guiding principle, had been obsolete from the start. Admiral Kurita, survivor of Leyte, put it bluntly. "We planned for one great battle. You built a new navy every year. The memory of Okinawa, where kamikazes died in flames and Yamato sank in a storm of bombs, lingered as proof. Japan had gambled everything on sacrifice. America had won through abundance. The Battle of Okinawa was the last act of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It ended not with triumph, but with futility. Great ships sunk without fuel, young pilots dying in fire, admirals writing farewell notes before hopeless missions. Meanwhile, American shipyards hammered steel day and night, launching new hulls faster than Japan could sink them. What began with disbelief in 1942, rumours of a battleship a month, ended in 1945 as undeniable truth. America's industrial power had overwhelmed not only Japan's navy, but its entire vision of warfare. The kamikaze storm had been Japan's last weapon. The factory was America's. One consumed its own sons in fire, the other produced ships, planes, and supplies without end. At Okinawa, the contrast was absolute. The war ended not simply because Japan was defeated at sea, but because Japanese leaders realized there was no horizon beyond which American shipyards could not reach. In the end, America's secret was not a single ship or weapon. It was the capacity to build, to supply, to replace, to create so much abundance that even the largest battleship and the bravest kamikaze could not alter the outcome. The Japanese admirals had once scoffed at reports of a battleship every month. By Okinawa, they no longer scoffed. They understood. And with that understanding came the final surrender.